Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Type 35 build. I'd like to show you all the wiring I've done on the car, but I can't. It's not that I don't want to, it's just I've spent a lot of time hiding all the wires, so there's really not a lot to see, which I'm kind of proud of, but that doesn't mean we can't peek at the nooks and crannies. Starting with the front cross member, because it's right in front of me. And the cutest little horn, which I got from a Vespa, specifically because the honk is more of a polite request compared to the outright demand of a typical car horn. But see if I can get a good angle. Nope, you really can't see it. So, the horn mounting bolt also holds a plate steel ground tree that allows all the negative leads from the horn, brake switch, headlights, turn signals, and everything to attach separately so each circuit is independent, and once the harness is finalized, they'll all get trimmed to their finished length and labeled. Next up is the crankshaft position sensor, which, surprisingly, ended up in the exact same place as the factory crank sensor. It points to a new crank trigger wheel. You can't really see. Nope, it's hidden. The MX-5 had a 4-tooth wheel, and I needed a 36 1-tooth. And the Protege had the tooth count I needed and bolted right up. The sensor's a Z-Tech reluctor style instead of the factory Hall type, and it's bolted to a snazzy little bracket that I carved some shape into so it looked less like a hunk of 3/16 plate, but I need a bushing to cover the top bolt threads. It's easy to see, so need to make it look good. Something not as easy to see, though, is the O2 sensor. It's mounted. See if I can get an angle. If you bend over the driver's side, look back, and way down below the brake master cylinder, you can just see the O2 sensor. So, I put a lot of thought into where I wanted to install the O2 at. I did not want that sensor to be seen. I didn't even want it at all, but I tucked it back towards the firewall, pointing down, so unless you're looking for it, at any casual angle, you're never going to see it. Some stuff, I think, this is a detail that's going to go overlooked. But this one, I plan to intentionally be overlooked. And I think the install is a lot cleaner for it. Speaking of clean, we got to talk about plug wires for a minute. Factory Type 35s had their plug wires routed inside a cellulose, sometimes plastic tube that ran back through the firewall. It's a feature I really liked about the original cars and wanted to recreate on mine. So, first I had to get the plug wires made and shipped to me, because, can you believe this? No one keeps plug wires for MX-5 engines with Z-Tech coils mounted to the dash of Type 35 recreations on the shelf. Who knew? But I got those ran inside the plastic tube, and it just looks so right. Doesn't it? There's a cap on the forward end, and on the firewall a grommet so it won't make any noise if it moves around, but the execution came out so pretty. And with the hood on, forget about it. That's gonna look sweet. Another part that came out looking, honestly, better than I expected was the cooling fan. Originally, I wanted to mount it between the radiator and the shell because an electric fan kinda alienated the vintage aesthetic of the car. But when I got to mocking it up, The whole assembly looked better with the radiator inset and the fan exposed rather than the fan hidden and the radiator exposed. So I notched the bottom of the radiator shell. That took a moment. I did not want to cut into that peach unless I absolutely had to. But with the radiator tucked deep into the shell and the fan mounted to its face, I don't know. I kind of like the fan being visible. Kind of speaks to the exposed mechanicals that make the original cars so fascinating. Something I did not want exposed though, if you look, there's a braided loom running downward away from the fan. And if we move to the driver's side, you can see, so you've got all the ground wires in front of the radiator. Now, these up here will all be hidden by a splash apron in the not too distant future. But where the wires are exposed, headlights, turn signals, horn, brake switch, all running rearward, I did not want a bunch of wires running loose everywhere. There was very little electrical on a Type 35, so I wanted to minimize the visual impact of the wiring throughout the car, which is really important when you get back to the engine. About the only wiring that you can really see attaches to the temp sensors on the back of the motor. You have to get around and down and look under the intake where all the wires for the entire engine are routed. There's a loom about the size of your thumb running off the throttle body for all its wiring. It snakes down and around and into the main loom, about 1.25 inches around, for all the fuel injection, starter, alternator charge cabling. Oh, the alternator. It got replaced. Late 1.8s were ECU regulated and early 1.8s were internal, so one new alternator and solved that problem. When you stand back though and look, from a normal distance, the loom virtually disappears. There's almost no visible wiring in the engine compartment when you're just casually looking at the car. I mean, considering all the electronics, that's just awesome. If you look down though, you can see where the main loom passes next to the motor mount, then disappears under the frame rail. It runs back, and if we turn and look, just before it passes through the firewall, there's a continuous duty solenoid. This is the master electrical cutoff for the entire car. When you turn the key, it energizes and connects the battery to all the electronics. While you couldn't ask for a better spot to put it, the factory mounting bracket, its holes have the exact same spacing as the lower firewall bolts have. That's just serendipitous. Back in the passenger's compartment, if I move around, we can get a better look at the main wiring harness. Every wire for the car runs through this loom. It's about as big around as my wrist, and I couldn't hide it. It's actually what prompted me to source the loom in the first place. With all the wire and cabling, I wanted something that had minimized their appearance as much as possible. But considering all the wire it's holding, it's impressively clean. One part I do like, you can't see the bracket that's suspending the loom in place. If you get up close and look, you can just see, attached to the bulkhead bracket, the tab. It's a sheet of aluminum curved so it holds the wires, and the loom wraps around it, and the bracket all but disappears. The loom then runs up and through an underdash that's going to end up being an elegant solution on how to mount all the car's electronics. There's still some work to be done to it, but It's going to be pretty cool. If I can get past the shifter, way up under the dash is the cutouts for the steering column and ignition key. And if we look backward, the front seam of the under dash that's an 1/8 inch short of the dash panel return. So that little seam that you can't see unless you stick your head under the dash and look backwards allows the under dash to drop cleanly past the dash panel return lip. So access to the car's electronics can be made on a single panel, all without the seam being visible when someone casually looks under the dash. But the wire hiding didn't end there. If you look along the passenger's frame rail, you gotta get real low, but you can just barely make out the thumb-sized loom running back under the frame. It travels rearward under the passenger seat, where the battery will eventually be mounted, hidden but easy to get to, and continues on, pinky-sized about now, along the rearward cross member, snaking its way up and out to the taillights. You can also just see the passenger's tail light and electric fuel pump wiring. All this will be tied down proper and hidden once the upholstery's installed, and we're getting there quick. What else do we have? Oh, the ignition key. So this is no big deal, but kind of neat. Everyone's been expecting a push-button start, but I wasn't for that. Every Econobox these days has a push-button start. A keyed ignition, though, is always classic. So I made an executive decision and installed the switch under the dash. But the neat part, beyond the fact that it uses a full-size key, is when it's returned from the start to the run position, the key can be removed. Think about that for a second. While driving, while the car's running at a show, no visible key. Unexpected coolness.